Good evening. I'm Nima and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, December 28th. And tonight, we begin with the latest updates on the fatal shooting of an Ontario provincial police officer. Court documents show 25-year-old Randall McKenzie and 30-year-old Brandy Crystal Lynn Stewart Sperry each face one count of first-degree murder. Constable Greg Prishala was shot yesterday afternoon while responding to a call about a vehicle in a ditch just west of Hagersville. The 28-year-old previously served in the military and as a special constable at the Ontario legislature. He had been with the provincial police for just over a year and found out yesterday that he had passed probation. More tragedy on the West Coast, where investigators are probing a Christmas Eve bus crash that claimed 4 lives and injured dozens on the Okanagan Connector. British Columbia's transport minister says they are also investigating another crash involving the same operator on the same route 4 days earlier. Rob Fleming says maintenance contractors were plowing and salting the road, also known as Highway 97C, on the day of the crash, and there was low precipitation. RCMP investigators say the bus, operated by Alberta-based e-bus company, had seat belts, but it appears that most passengers were not wearing them. Canadians in several provinces who were caught violating federal COVID-19 quarantine rules racked up at least $15 million in fines this year. Now, that's according to data from the Public Health Agency of Canada. Some of the most common offenses were entering the country without a pre-arrival test, refusing to do a COVID test upon arrival, and refusing to answer questions from a public health officer. But only 95 of the more than 3,000 tickets have been paid so far. Now, this means $3.5 million is still outstanding. Experts say intimate partner violence intensified during the COVID-19 pandemic in Canada. Rhiannon Wong is the Technology Safety Project Manager at the Women's Shelters Canada, and she says the rise in violence was fueled by new technology and lockdowns that limited a victim's ability to leave abusive relationships. She says digital forms of domestic abuse began increasing in 2020. This came as tech became more integrated into everyday life. Abusers are able to use smart home or smart car technologies to track partners in real time and impersonate or harass them. Women's Safety Canada will be launching a national website on tech-facilitated gender-based violence in February to help victims better access services. All right, well, meanwhile, emergency call centers in Quebec are facing staffing shortages, which are lengthening dispatch times for ambulances and forcing workers to juggle 911 calls for heart attacks and other emergencies. Now, that's according to the union representing workers in the pre-hospital emergency care sector. The union is calling on the province to boost financial resources to avert what it calls a catastrophic breakdown in services. It says dispatchers try to answer a call within 30 seconds and get an ambulance on the road within 2 minutes. But now, it sometimes takes 2 or 3 minutes just to get an answer. Ontario's University Health Network is seeing a dramatic improvement in ambulance offloading times and freed up ER beds. This comes after opening a standalone clinic near Toronto Western Hospital. Paramedics can now drop off homeless people intoxicated by alcohol so they can recover and then access 24-hour-a-day services from harm reduction workers, peer support workers, case workers, and a physician on call. Analysts are predicting another year of modest growth for Canadian oil and gas companies. Those companies are expected to increase spending in 2023. However, experts aren't forecasting a return to boom times as the risk of a recession weigh on the sector. Canada's energy sector posted record profits this year as the war in Ukraine and the end of the pandemic restrictions drove commodity prices sky high. Canadian Blood Services says it's in need of blood and plasma donors after the winter storm disrupted donations over the holidays. Severe wind, snowfall, and icy conditions that hit many parts of the country meant that about 10% of expected blood and plasma donations did not happen. The organization says there is a critical need for platelets for patients undergoing cancer treatments and O-negative blood for newborns and emergencies. Well, she's described as one of the greatest clutch performers this country has ever produced. And now, Canadian women's hockey team captain Marie-Philippe Poulin has been voted by sports editors and broadcasters as the Canadian Press Female Athlete of the Year. The 31-year-old forward is from Beauceville, Quebec, and this year she became the only hockey player in the world, male or female, to score goals in 4 straight Olympic hockey finals. Her 2 goals paced Canada to a 3-2 win over the U.S. for gold in Beijing. All right, stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back. Up next, a look at major news stories and headlines out of the United States. Stay tuned. Temperatures are rising in Buffalo, New York. This brings some relief, but also the tragic possibility of finding more victims as the snow melts from the area's deadliest storm in decades. At least 28 people are reported to have died in the area because of the blizzard on Friday and Saturday. While suburban roads and most major highways in the area reopened yesterday, there is still a driving ban in Buffalo. The storm is blamed for at least 49 deaths across the country. Meanwhile, amid tensions with Russia, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke on the release of a Canadian-American businessman. He said securing the release of Paul Whelan remains a top priority for the Biden administration. Mr. Whelan was detained in Russia 4 years ago and sentenced to 16 years in prison on espionage charges, which his family and the U.S. government say are baseless. American officials had hoped to include Mr. Whelan in a prisoner swap earlier this month. It was involving WNBA star Brittany Griner. But they say Russia refused to consider including Mr. Whelan in the deal, calling it a one or none decision. U.S. officials say they will continue to press for his release. All right, turning to a major move from the top court in the United States. For now, the U.S. Supreme Court is keeping pandemic-era limits in place on people seeking asylum. Now, this dashes the hopes of migrants who have been fleeing violence and inequality. The court also set a February timeline for arguments in the case. The restrictions referred to a Title 42 were put in place under then-President Donald Trump. This was at the beginning of the pandemic to curb the spread of COVID-19, and they have been used 2.5 million times to prevent migrants from seeking asylum in the U.S. Turning now to controversy after the U.S. midterm elections. U.S. Congressman-elect George Santos, a New York Republican, has admitted that he lied about his job experience and college education. This was during his successful campaign for a seat in the U.S. House. Mr. Santos tells the New York Post, quote, "My sins here are embellishing my resume. I'm sorry." Democrats note that the word embellishment does not excuse outright lies. Mr. Santos said that he obtained degrees from Baruch College and NYU, but he now acknowledges that he didn't graduate from any institution of higher learning. He also said that he had worked for Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, but he now says he never worked directly for either financial firm. All right, well, meanwhile, holiday travel chaos continues in the United States. Families hoping to catch a Southwest Airlines flight are suffering through another wave of scrubbed flights. This comes after days of cancellations, missing luggage, and missed family connections. Another 2,500 flights are being pulled from arrival and departure boards on Wednesday, and more are expected throughout the day. Exhausted travelers are seeking alternative routes with other airlines on the ground by rental car or train, or they've simply given up. According to FlightAware tracking service, more than 91% of all canceled flights in the U.S. early Wednesday were from Southwest, which has been unable to recover from ferocious winter storms that hit parts of the country over the weekend. The cost of living crisis continues to impact life around the world, including in the United States. A survey by the U.S. Employee Benefit Research Institute finds more than 25% of retirees say they're spending more than they can afford. With inflation at 7.1% in the U.S. last month, it's not surprising that savings aren't going as far as they used to. Experts say there are ways that retirees can bring in extra income with part-time jobs. Meanwhile, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration says the North Atlantic right whale will remain protected under the Endangered Species Act. There are only about 340 of the whales left, and NOAA says that number is continuing to decline. This is because of threats from fishing gear, collisions with ships, and other stressors. NOAA also released recommended actions to try to stabilize the whales' population, which include partnering with the Canadian government to reduce collisions and entanglements. A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket carrying 54 Starlink satellites lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida before sunrise today. It is part of a plan to bring internet coverage to parts of the world that don't currently have it. This was the 60th SpaceX launch of the year, but with just 3 days left in 2022, it might not be the last. The company plans to lift an Israeli Earth imaging satellite into orbit later this week. All right, ending the segment on a lighter note. Toronto-based scenic artist Ray Lalonde is continuing his winning streak on Jeopardy! Mr. Lalonde won his 9th game last night and has now amassed total winnings of over $255,000. By comparison, during her 23-game winning streak earlier this year, fellow Canadian Matea Roach won over $560,000. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back with a look at Japan's recently announced defense strategy. Japan's recent move announcing a new national security strategy earlier this month is getting some mixed reactions from international leaders. Allies of Japan, including Canada, the US, and Australia, are supporting the new strategy, while those looking to gain more dominance in the region, including China, are expressing concern. Experts say that this new plan would allow Japan to play a stronger role in regional and global security affairs. Well, joining us now to give us more insight into Japan's national security strategy and what this means for Canada's efforts in the Indo-Pacific is Dr. Kyoko Kuwahara, research fellow at the Japan Institute of International Affairs and visiting fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. Kuwahara, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with a brief overview of the new national security strategy and what kind of new capabilities it would allow Japan to have.
Oh, yes, Japan understands that it is facing the most severe security environment since the Second World War, as we've been witnessing some concerns piling up, such as China's expansion of military power, North Korea's nuclear developments, and Russian invasion in Ukraine, as well as a power balance shift in the Pacific region. In that sense, in order to respond to those environmental changes and to protect itself, Japan has determined to update its conventional security strategy to adapt itself to the current security environments and to address more security cooperation and collaboration with the United States, Canada, and other partners for a wider range of deterrence against any other security threats.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the missile capabilities involved in this national security plan, especially considering the multiple missile tests in the region?
Oh, yes, Japan's counter-strike capability has been gaining attention in that sense. The unused counter-strike capability is not just about the ballistic missile defense. According to the strategy or Japanese government, Japan will develop its defense capabilities to the point that at which it will be able to disrupt or defeat invasion and against Japan itself much earlier and at the further distance. So this means that it is not only for the ballistic missile defense, but also for disrupting invasion or aggression against Japan itself. So this might change Japan's conventional definition of defense-oriented policy in the future.
So what does this mean for Japan's overall role in the Indo-Pacific in terms of security, especially compared to its previous role with its self-defense only post-war principle?
Oh, yes, Japan's understanding on the current security environment in the Pacific region. It's not just about China, Russia, or North Korea threats in themselves. Japan is concerned about any other aggression or actions posed by those countries, which is their challenges to the international order. So Japan recognizes the growing security threats and the concerns piling up Indo-Pacific region. And I would say that Japan doesn't regard these three countries as a threat in themselves. And Japan is more cautious about any other actions, behavior, which challenge to the international order. So at the same time, in that point, in that sense, this new system will enable Japan to deter aggression if it cooperates with the United States and other partners. So in other words, it will be part of the international society deterrence as a whole.
Lots of developments to keep our eyes on, Dr. Kuwahara. A little over a minute left here, but I want to bring this back to Canada. So I know in November, Canada released a long-delayed Indo-Pacific strategy. It particularly highlights China's efforts in the region. So how would Japan's new security strategy complement Canada's particular goals in the region?
Yes, at the point, Japan will host next year, 2023 G7 summit as a chair country. So this will be maybe a great opportunity both for Japan and for Canada. So Japan is willing to cooperate more with Canada. And in the Indo-Pacific strategy, the word Japan is actually mentioned 25 times. So which is more than the number of mentions of any other countries or region. So now Japan is trying to cooperate more with its partners and Canada under this new security strategy. So in that sense, both countries could be a natural partner in that region and will be able to do together more for peace and stability in the region.
Another informative interview. Dr. Kuwahara, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to be taking a look at the major news stories and headlines from around the world as China loosens its zero COVID policies for travel. North Korea says it will continue weapons development. Ukraine says it will develop combat drones, and extremist violence spreads in West Africa. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world after the break, so stay tuned. Forum Daily will be back. Stock markets are mostly lower in Europe and Asia as investors count down to the end of a painful year. This with no end in sight to uncertainties stemming from the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Shares fell in Frankfurt, Paris, Tokyo, Shanghai, and Seoul, but they rose in London and Hong Kong. This came as the Chinese government took further steps to reopen to foreign travel after relaxing its zero COVID policies. Not all world markets are ending the year on low notes, but most have suffered as interest rate increases, waves of coronavirus infections, the war, supply chain disruptions, and surging inflation took a toll on businesses and investments. All right, focusing on China's revised travel rules now, the country says it will resume issuing passports for tourism. This is in another big step away from antivirus controls, which isolated the country for almost 3 years. Now, that sets up a potential flood of millions of Chinese going abroad for next month's Lunar New Year holiday. The announcement adds to abrupt changes, rolling back some of the world's strictest pandemic controls as the government tries to reverse an economic slump. Well, amid rising tensions on the Korean peninsula, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un has presented unspecified goals, which will further bolster his military power next year. His comments were made at a meeting of the nation's political officials. The announcement, reported by state media, indicates that he will continue provocative weapons tests. This comes after a record run of missile launches this year. Some observers say that the new goals could be related to Mr. Kim's push to expand his nuclear arsenal and introduce a spat of high-tech weapons systems. All right, turning to the conflict in Ukraine now. The country's minister in charge of technology says Ukraine is developing combat drones to attack the ones that Russia has used. Now, this is according to an interview by the Associated Press with the Minister of Digital Transformation, Mikhailo Fedorov, who described Russia's war in Ukraine as the first major war of the internet age. He credited drones and satellite internet systems like Elon Musk's Starlink with having transformed the conflict. Mr. Fedorov says the Ukrainian military has so far used drones mostly for reconnaissance and that strike drones are the next step. Ethiopian Airlines has resumed scheduled flights to Tigray's capital, Mekelle. The move comes as the result of a peace agreement which was signed between the federal government and Tigray officials in November. The Tigray region had been largely cut off from the rest of the world during the 2-year conflict, in which hundreds of thousands of people have died. But communications are slowly resuming as phone lines started to be restored in parts of the region. Staying in Africa, where violence linked to Al Qaeda and the Islamic State group is spreading to West Africa's coastal states, and Benin is the hardest hit. This is according to the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which says attacks have spiked more than tenfold between July and December. This is compared to the same period last year. Analysts say that if the violence escalates and spreads, it could have far-reaching geopolitical consequences. They say the violence in Benin is largely coming from neighboring Burkina Faso. Well, as Israel prepares for a new government, a package of coalition agreements is laying the groundwork for what is expected to be a stormy beginning for Benjamin Netanyahu's incoming hardline government. The package puts West Bank settlement expansion at the top of a list of priorities, which vow to legalize dozens of illegally built outposts and annex the occupied territory as part of its coalition deal with its ultra-national allies. Turning our attention to a tragedy in the Philippines. Officials say that the death toll from heavy rains and floods over the Christmas weekend have left at least 29 people dead. 25 others are missing. The National Disaster Response Agency says over 86,000 people are in shelters and some areas still lack power or water. The Vatican says 95-year-old Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI is very sick and he's getting worse. Doctors are constantly monitoring his condition. Pope Francis visited him today. Pope Emeritus Benedict was the first pope to resign in 600 years. All right, well, in a happy holiday development, a Wisconsin waitress got quite the Christmas morning tip from a generous customer. The Wisconsin State Journal reports 29-year-old Callie Blue was waiting tables at Gus's Diner in Sun Prairie on Sunday. This was when a customer left her with a $1,000 tip. The customer was Michael Johnson, president and CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Dane County. And he says he was looking for people in need as part of the club's Pay It Forward campaign. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on our social media handles. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.